Liam and Noah were not strangers to risk, but their latest acquisition was a gamble that teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. They ran a specialized recovery yard that focused on wet salvage, buying rights to vessels that had already sunk, raising them, and selling the raw materials. It was dangerous, dirty, and expensive work. Their target was the HMS Goliath, a 1950s ocean-going tugboat that had floundered in a storm off the coast nearly 70 years ago. The rights to the wreck were incredibly cheap because the depth made recovery a nightmare, but the brothers had calculated the steel weight and determined that if they could get it to the surface, the scrap value alone would save their struggling business. The operation to raise the Goliath took 3 weeks of relentless effort. Giant lift bags were attached to the hull by divers fighting strong currents, and slowly, the rusting Leviathan broke the surface of the Atlantic, gasping for air for the first time in decades. Towed into their dry dock, the ship looked like a beast from a nightmare. It was draped in heavy nets of seaweed, encrusted with tons of barnacles, and oozing black, anaerobic mud that smelled of sulfur and rot. To anyone else, it was a disgusting heap of trash. To Liam and Noah, it was a paycheck. However, they had no idea that the rusted hull was merely a shell protecting something far more valuable than simple scrap steel. The brothers began the arduous process of mucking out, using high-pressure fire hoses to blast away the decades of sediment that filled the interior compartments. They worked methodically from the bow to the stern, cutting away debris and assessing the structural integrity of the steel. The ship was built like a tank, heavily armored for ice-breaking duties, which explained why the hull remained largely intact despite the crushing water pressure it had endured. But their primary focus was the engine room. In ships of this era, the engine room was the heart of the value, containing massive amounts of copper, brass, and high-grade steel. Hey guys! Before we dive deeper into the dark heart of this sunken ship, we need to ask for a huge favor. We are incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and reaching that milestone would mean the world to our team. If you are enjoying this deep-sea mystery, please smash that subscribe button right now. Also, if you want to support our channel directly, check out the Super Thanks button below. It helps us fund these crazy salvage stories. And we are curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. We love seeing our global salvage crew. Now, let's get back to the engine room. Reaching the engine room required cutting through a watertight bulkhead that had sealed the compartment when the ship went down. This was a stroke of luck. A sealed compartment meant the machinery inside hadn't been exposed to the corrosive salt water in the same way the exterior had. When the cutting torch finally sliced through the last hinge and the heavy steel door groaned open, a rush of stale, pressurized air hissed out, breath from 1958. Liam led the way, his headlamp cutting through the gloom. The water level inside this compartment was only waist-high, indicating the seal had held remarkably well. Looming in the center of the cavernous space was the engine. It was a monster. Even covered in a layer of oil and grime, the sheer scale of the machine was breathtaking. It was AV-16 configuration, a massive power plant designed to tow aircraft carriers and battleships. But as Noah wiped a gloved hand across the valve covers, he noticed something strange. Standard marine engines of that era were cast iron, rough, heavy, and prone to immediate surface rust. The metal beneath the oil here was smooth, cool, and oddly reflective. It had a greenish-silver hue that didn't look like iron or steel. They set up industrial lighting to inspect their find. As the halogen beams flooded the room, the true nature of the engine began to reveal itself. It wasn't just a standard diesel motor. The plumbing and intake manifolds were overly complex, featuring a twin turbocharger setup that was far ahead of its time for the late 50s. The engineering tolerances appeared aerospace-grade rather than maritime. Liam climbed onto the catwalk surrounding the upper cylinder heads and found the manufacturer's plate. Usually, this would bear the name of a giant like General Motors or Fairbanks Morse. Instead, the plate was blank, save for a stamped series of numbers and a single word etched deeply into the metal, NAOBIUM. The brothers were baffled. They knew scrap metal better than anyone, and they knew that niobium was a rare, transition metal used in superalloys for jet engines and rockets, not for tugboat diesels. If this massive block was actually cast from a high-performance alloy, its melt value alone would be astronomical compared to cast iron. But why would a humble tugboat be fitted with such an exotic, expensive, and experimental engine? They decided to stop the demolition immediately. They weren't cutting this engine up. They needed to clean it, document it, and find out exactly what the HMS Goliath was actually testing when it sank. They spent the next 2 days carefully cleaning the external components, using specialized solvents to remove the hardened oil without damaging the strange metal. As layers of grime were removed, the engine looked less like a piece of salvage and more like a piece of art. It was pristine. The oil in the crankcase had preserved the internals perfectly. Noah used a breaker bar to try and turn the flywheel, expecting it to be seized solid after 70 years. To their absolute shock, with a heavy grunt and a shove, the massive internal assembly rotated. The pistons moved. The engine was not dead, it was sleeping. This mechanical miracle sent a shiver down Liam's spine. A functional, 16-cylinder prototype engine made of a rare alloy, recovered from a sealed time capsule. They realized they needed to bring in an expert before they touched another bolt. They took detailed photographs of the unique fuel injection system and the strange niobium plate and emailed them to a contact at a maritime museum in London, a man who specialized in experimental naval warfare. They expected a reply in a few days. They got a phone call in 10 minutes. The voice on the other end was trembling. They hadn't just found an engine. They had found the ghost of the Atlantic, a propulsion system that was rumored to exist in Cold War intelligence files but had never been seen in the flesh. The scrap value was irrelevant now. They were sitting on the maritime equivalent of a lost Da Vinci painting. The arrival of Dr. Silas Vance at the salvage yard was as dramatic as the phone call. Within hours, a convoy of 2 black SUVs pulled up to the muddy gates of Liam and Noah's facility. Vance was not the dusty academic type they had expected. He was a man who moved with the precision of military personnel, flanked by 2 assistants carrying heavy, Pelican-style hard cases. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or paperwork. His focus was entirely on the HMS Goliath. He donned a pristine white hazmat suit, a stark contrast to the brothers' oil-stained coveralls, and signaled for them to lead him into the belly of the resurrected beast. The atmosphere shifted from a salvage operation to a crime scene investigation. As the group descended into the humid, metallic depths of the ship, the sound of their boots clanging on the steel grates echoed through the hull. When they reached the engine room, Vance stopped dead in his tracks. The portable floodlights illuminated the massive V-16, casting long, spider-like shadows against the bulkheads. Vance approached the machine slowly, almost reverently, running his gloved hand along the sleek, silver-blue cylinder banks. He produced a handheld device, an X-ray fluorescence XRF analyzer, used to determine the elemental composition of metals. He placed the sensor against the engine block and pulled the trigger. The device beeped, and Vance stared at the screen in disbelief. He showed the screen to Liam and Noah. The readout confirmed their wildest suspicions. The engine block wasn't cast iron or steel. It was a solid cast monologue of a niobium titanium alloy, a material so incredibly expensive and difficult to work with that it was usually reserved for the intake nozzles of rocket engines or the hulls of deep-sea submersibles. A block of this size, weighing nearly 20 tons, was not just a piece of machinery. It was a strategic resource. The raw melt value of the metal alone was calculated in the millions, far exceeding the brothers' lifetime earnings. But Vance signaled that the metal was the least interesting part. He directed his assistants to set up an industrial endoscope. He wanted to see inside the combustion chambers without removing the head, preserving the seal. They fed the fiber-optic camera through one of the injector ports. The image appeared on a large monitor set up on a workbench. The interior of the cylinder was flawless. There was no pitting, no rust, and no carbon buildup. The cylinder walls were lined with a ceramic composite that looked brand new. It became clear that this engine had barely been run. It was a prototype that had likely been installed, tested once, and then immediately lost to the ocean. Vance then gestured towards the front of the engine, pointing to the massive governor housing, the mechanical brain that controlled the engine's speed. He suspected that if there were any answers to the origins of this ghost of the Atlantic, they would be hidden there. Liam brought over a set of non-sparking bronze tools. Carefully, bolt by bolt, they removed the heavy cover of the governor. As the plate came loose, a small amount of preserved, amber-colored oil wept out. Inside, the mechanism was a watchmaker's dream of gears and springs, but wedged behind the main drive gear was a foreign object. It was a cylinder made of brass, screw-top sealed, coated in heavy wax to waterproof it. It looked like a pneumatic tube capsule from an old bank. Noah carefully extracted it with long nose pliers. The object was heavy and rattled slightly. They took it to the workbench, wiping away the oil. Vance nodded for them to open it. Liam gripped the brass tube and twisted. The seal cracked, and he unscrewed the cap. Inside, rolled tightly, were documents wrapped in oil paper and a set of microfilm reels. They carefully unrolled the papers. They were technical schematics for Project Silent Runner, dated 1957. The documents detailed the engine's purpose. It was an experimental, non-magnetic propulsion system designed to allow surface ships to pass over magnetic naval mines without detonating them. The niobium alloy wasn't just for strength, it was for stealth. The Cold War implications were massive. This tugboat was intended to be a minesweeper capable of clearing paths for NATO fleets without being detected or blown up. However, the most chilling discovery was the handwritten logbook included in the tube. The final entry wasn't technical. It was a warning. The chief engineer of the Goliath, a man named Commander Sterling, had written that the trials were too successful. He noted that foreign agents had infiltrated the shipyard and were planning to hijack the vessel to steal the technology for the Soviet Union. Sterling's final line was a confession. He hadn't lost the ship to a storm. He had intentionally flooded the engine room and scuttled the vessel in deep water to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands. The brothers looked at the engine with new eyes. It wasn't just a prototype, it was a hero's sacrifice. They had raised a vessel that was deliberately murdered to protect a state secret. But the mystery wasn't fully solved. The schematics in the brass tube referenced a secondary stage component, a device attached to the engine that generated the power required for the non-magnetic field. The blueprints showed it should be mounted to the rear of the transmission. The brothers looked at the rear of the engine. There was a mounting flange, but it was empty. The component was missing. Vance became frantic. He explained that the secondary stage likely contained a compact radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a nuclear battery, used to energize the hull. If that component was missing, it meant someone might have gotten to the wreck before it sank, or worse, it had detached during the sinking and was still down there in the mud. Or, most frighteningly, Commander Sterling had hidden it somewhere else on the ship before he sent it to the bottom. The salvage operation had just escalated from a recovery mission to a nuclear hunt. Liam grabbed a Geiger counter from their safety kit. He swept it over the engine. The reading was normal. He moved towards the rear of the engine room, near the propeller shaft tunnel. The device began to click rhythmically. The pace increased as he approached a welded maintenance hatch on the floor of the shaft tunnel. The click became a steady buzz. The missing component, and the source of immense, potentially dangerous power, wasn't lost in the ocean. It was sealed beneath the floorboards of the tugboat they were standing in. The rhythmic clicking of the Geiger counter transformed the atmosphere in the engine room from one of excitement to immediate, visceral fear. The sound was the invisible heartbeat of a deadly force. Dr. Vance immediately ordered a full evacuation of the lower deck, but Liam and Noah stood their ground, realizing that leaving the potential leak unattended was not an option in their own shipyard. They were not dealing with a simple engine part anymore. They were standing on top of an unregulated nuclear source. Vance, realizing the brothers weren't leaving, shifted gears from academic observer to crisis manager. He ran to his cases and produced 3 heavy-duty, lead-lined aprons and industrial dosimeters, handing them out with shaking hands. The radiation wasn't at lethal levels yet. It was shielded by the steel deck, but once they cut that metal, they would be exposing themselves to the raw core of the Cold War. The plan was surgical. They could not use cutting torches. The heat might destabilize whatever chemical or pressurized components remained inside the containment unit. Instead, Noah brought in a hydraulic cold-cutting saw, a tool used for severing underwater pipelines without generating sparks or heat. The noise of the saw was deafening in the enclosed acoustic chamber of the hull, a high-pitched scream of diamond teeth grinding through vintage naval steel. Liam managed the water coolant feed, keeping the blade wet to suppress dust, while Vance watched the radiation levels like a hawk, his eyes darting between the cut line and his digital reader. The tension was palpable. Every millimeter the blade descended was a gamble against physics and history. After an agonizing hour of cutting, a perfect 1-meter square section of the deck plate was free. They rigged a chain hoist to the overhead gantry crane and hooked it to the cut section. With the press of a button, the electric winch whined, and the heavy steel slab lifted slowly into the air, swinging gently. As the plate rose, the Geiger counter's clicking accelerated into a solid, angry buzz. Beneath the floorboards, nestled between the ship's structural ribs in a space that shouldn't have existed, was a coffin-sized box made of dull, gray lead. It was heavily oxidized but intact, bolted directly to the keel of the ship. This was the secondary stage, the power source for the silent drive. But the lead coffin wasn't the only thing in the hole. As Noah leaned in with a flashlight, the beam caught the glint of copper wire. It was a tripwire system. Commander Sterling hadn't just hidden the device. He had rigged it. A series of tension wires were connected from the lid of the lead box to a cluster of glass canisters mounted on the bulkheads of the small compartment. The canisters were filled with a dark, viscous liquid that had not evaporated in 70 years. Vance recognized the setup immediately and grabbed Noah by the shoulder, yanking him back. It was a binary liquid explosive trap, designed to mix and detonate if the lead box was forced open by unauthorized hands. The ship was scuttled to hide the tech, but the trap was set to destroy it utterly if it was ever salvaged. They were now trapped in a stalemate. The radiation source was exposed, leaking low-level gamma rays into the room, but they couldn't move the box without triggering a chemical explosion that would likely vaporize the engine room and everyone in it. Vance analyzed the trap mechanism. It was mechanical, relying on spring tension. The wires were taut, rusted but still holding the hammers back from the glass vials. The vibration of the cold-cutting saw had been a massive risk. They were lucky the rust hadn't given way. To recover the prize, they had to act as bomb disposal technicians. They needed to neutralize the tension on the wires before they could unbolt the lead coffin. Liam, who had the steadiest hands of the 3, volunteered for the task. He grabbed a pair of fine-point wire cutters and a can of penetrating oil. He had to lubricate the rusted firing pins without applying enough pressure to release them. He lay on his stomach on the cold steel grating, his face inches from the deadly glass vials. The smell of the ancient, stagnant air from the hole was overwhelming. He applied the oil, drop by microscopic drop, watching the dark fluid soak into the seized mechanisms. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the ventilation fans and the terrified beating of their own hearts. One slip, one tremor, and the salvage job would turn into a crater. After 20 minutes of excruciatingly delicate work, Liam signaled he was ready. He clamped the firing pins in place with locking pliers, bypassing the trigger mechanism. Then, with a singular, decisive snip, he cut the tension wire. The wire snapped back with a twang that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The brothers flinched. Nothing happened. The pliers held. The glass vials remained unbroken. They released a collective breath they felt they had been holding since the morning. The trap was neutralized. The path to the nuclear battery was clear. With the trap disabled, they could finally focus on the lead box. They unbolted it from the keel, the nuts groaning in protest as they were forced off their rusted threads. Using the gantry crane, they hoisted the lead sarcophagus out of the pit and lowered it onto a heavy-duty transport dolly. Vance approached it, checking the seals. It was a Model X-1 naval reactor, a localized isotope generator that was theoretically impossible for the 1950s. It was worth more than the gold on a Spanish galleon. But as they wheeled the heavy device towards the cargo bay doors to get it out of the confined space, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't mechanical. It was the distinct heavy thrum of a helicopter rotor beat, rapidly approaching their location outside. The brothers exchanged a look of confusion. They hadn't called for air support, and Vance looked genuinely terrified. He rushed to the porthole, wiping away the grime to peer out at the gray sky. A black, unmarked helicopter was banking sharply over their salvage yard, circling the Goliath. It wasn't a news chopper or a Coast Guard rescue unit. It was military-grade, sleek and menacing, with no registration numbers visible. The foreign agents mentioned in Commander Sterling's logbook were long dead, but the secret of the niobium engine and the nuclear battery had apparently woken up ghosts that were very much alive and monitoring the situation. The salvage operation was no longer a secret. They had been watched the moment they raised the ship. The roar of the rotor blades whipped the stagnant air of the salvage yard into a frenzy of dust and flying debris. The matte black helicopter touched down on the cracked concrete pad just outside the main hangar, its landing skid sparking against the grit. The machine bore no flag, no tail number, and no markings of any known agency. The side door slid open before the skids even settled, and 4 figures emerged. They were dressed in tactical gray uniforms, their faces obscured by ballistic masks and tinted visors. They moved with the aggressive, fluid efficiency of a private military contractor rather than standard law enforcement. They carried assault rifles at the low-ready position, signaling that this was not a negotiation. It was a raid. Liam reacted on instinct born from years of working in dangerous industrial environments. He slammed his fist onto the emergency lockdown button mounted on the hangar wall. High above, the massive electric motors of the drydock doors groaned to life. The heavy corrugated steel sheets began to descend, rolling down like a guillotine to seal the facility. The tactical team outside saw the doors closing and sprinted toward the gap, but they were too late. The heavy steel slammed shut with a thunderous boom, plunging the cavernous drydock into a gloom illuminated only by the harsh yellow work lights. They were locked in, but the intruders were locked out. For now. Inside the sealed fortress, panic threatened to take over, but Dr. Vance grabbed the brothers' attention with a frantic wave. He pulled a satellite phone from his case, showing them the screen. He had already triggered a silent alarm to the Royal Navy's Historical Assets Division the moment he identified the engine, but the military response team was still 20 minutes out. The helicopter outside belonged to a rival entity, a recovery syndicate that specialized in stealing high-value technology before governments could secure it. These mercenaries weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to sanitize the site and take the niobium engine and the nuclear battery. If they breached the doors before the Navy arrived, the brothers would likely disappear along with the ship. They had to hide the assets. The niobium engine was too large to move, bolted firmly to the ship's frame, but the nuclear battery, the Model X-1 generator inside the lead coffin, was mobile and the primary target. Noah sprinted to the control cab of the overhead gantry crane. The heavy chains rattled as he maneuvered the hook over the transport dolly. Liam and Vance worked frantically to secure the rigging straps around the lead box. The sound of cutting torches hissing against the outer steel doors began to echo through the hangar. The sparks were already flying through the seams. The mercenaries were cutting the lock bars. They had less than 3 minutes before the breach. Noah hoisted the lead coffin into the air. Instead of moving it to a corner or hiding it behind scrap piles where it would be easily found by a thermal sweep, he drove the crane toward the ceiling. High above the Goliath, suspended from the roof trusses, was an old, rusted ventilation duct system that had been disconnected years ago. It was a jagged, dark maw of sheet metal. With surgical precision, Noah lowered the heavy lead box into the open mouth of the duct, deep in the shadows of the rafters. He released the straps, and the box settled into the darkness, completely invisible from the ground. He retracted the hook and killed the crane's lights, leaving the mechanism idle at the far end of the track to avoid suspicion. The cutting stopped. A heavy silence filled the hangar, heavier than the air inside the tugboat. Then, with a concussive blast that shook the dust from the ceiling, the service door next to the main gate was kicked inward. The 4 tactical operators flooded into the room, their weapon lights cutting through the haze like laser beams. They swept the area in seconds, identifying the 3 targets. Liam and Noah stood on the raised deck of the Goliath, their hands clearly visible, holding nothing but heavy pipe wrenches, useless as weapons against rifles, but symbolic of their defiance. Vance stood behind them, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a shield. The leader of the tactical team signaled for his men to secure the perimeter. They ignored the brothers for a moment, their attention immediately drawn to the shimmering, silver-blue block of the niobium engine exposed in the tugboat's hull. The leader approached the vessel, scanning the engine with a handheld device similar to the one Vance had used. He nodded to his team. The prize was confirmed. But then he turned, his visor reflecting the yellow work lights, and gestured aggressively around the room. He was looking for the second signature. The radiation signature. But the lead box was gone, shielded by the distance and the thick steel of the roof trusses above. The mercenary leader stepped onto the gangway of the ship, closing the distance to Liam. He didn't speak, but his body language was clear. He pointed a gloved finger at the empty space in the floorboards where the battery had been cut out, then pointed at the brothers. He wanted the core. Liam stood his ground, his face a mask of stone. He slowly raised a hand and pointed not to a hiding spot, but to the massive industrial electromagnet dangling from the secondary crane above the mercenaries' extraction vehicle outside, a bluff suggesting they had control over more than just the indoor space. It was a stalling tactic, a silent game of poker played with life and death stakes. The mercenary raised his rifle, leveling it at Liam's chest. The threat was imminent. But before he could pull the trigger or issue a command, a new sound began to permeate the hangar, a low, vibrating rumble that grew rapidly in intensity. It wasn't the chop of a helicopter this time. It was the screaming whine of jet turbines and the heavy thud of heavy transport tires hitting the tarmac outside. Blue flashing lights began to strobe through the gaps in the cut door. The Royal Navy response team had arrived, and they had brought heavy armor. The tactical leader froze. He looked at his wrist computer, then at the sealed main doors, and finally at the brothers. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. The calculated risk of a stealth extraction had failed. He tapped his headset, signaling an abort. The team moved instantly, backing away from the ship with disciplined speed, throwing smoke canisters onto the hangar floor to cover their retreat. Thick, white, acrid smoke filled the air, blinding the brothers. By the time the smoke cleared and the Navy Special Forces breached the main gates with an armored personnel carrier, the black helicopter was already lifting off, disappearing into the overcast sky like a phantom. The brothers were safe, but they were now standing in a salvage yard swarming with government agents, holding the secrets to a Cold War mystery that was far from over. The chaos of the raid subsided into a controlled, bureaucratic storm. Within an hour, the salvage yard had been transformed into a temporary military forward operating base. Heavily armed Royal Marine Commandos secured the perimeter, while specialized hazardous material teams in full containment suits swarmed the HMS Goliath. Liam and Noah, still adrenaline dumping from the standoff, watched from the sidelines as the hangar they had built with their own hands was commandeered by the Ministry of Defense. The arrival of a high-ranking naval attaché, Admiral Holloway, signaled the shift from a tactical situation to a strategic negotiation. He didn't look at the brothers as scrap merchants. He looked at them as men who had successfully safeguarded a crown jewel of national security. Dr. Vance acted as the liaison, explaining the situation to the Admiral. When the moment came to reveal the location of the secondary stage, Noah simply pointed upward. A specialized lifting team was dispatched to the roof trusses. As the lead-lined coffin was lowered from the dusty darkness of the ventilation duct, a ripple of awe went through the assembled military technicians. The brothers hadn't just saved the device from the mercenaries. They had hidden it so effectively that even the government sensors hadn't initially picked it up. The Model X-1 nuclear battery was secured, scanned, and immediately loaded onto an armored transport convoy. The battery alone, Vance whispered to them later, contained isotopes that were no longer produced and were essential for next-generation deep space satellite calibration. Its value was incalculable. The niobium engine, however, was the main event. Engineers spent the next 3 days meticulously dismantling the hull of the tugboat around the engine, treating the ship like a wrapper that needed to be discarded to get to the candy. The engine block was too valuable to be cut or risked. The ship had to be sacrificed. Liam and Noah watched as their scrap purchase was surgically disassembled by laser cutters. The massive, silver-blue V-16 was lifted free of its rusting cradle, gleaming under the lights, a testament to a forgotten era of ambitious engineering. It was destined for a classified research facility, where its metallurgy would be reverse-engineered to improve modern stealth submarines. The legal aftermath was swift and surprisingly generous. Because the HMS Goliath had been purchased legally at auction, the brothers technically owned the physical materials. However, the technology fell under the Official Secrets Act. They couldn't keep the engine or the battery, but the government could not simply seize them without compensation. A specialized tribunal was held in a closed room in London. The brothers were presented with a settlement offer that factored in the raw value of the niobium, which had skyrocketed in price since the 1950s, the rarity of the isotopes, and a substantial hazard and recovery fee for defending the assets against foreign hostiles. The final settlement was staggering. The government agreed to a payout of £14.2 million, approximate $18 million, tax-free, classified as a National Heritage Recovery Award. The check handed to them across the mahogany table was heavier than any steel plate they had ever lifted. In addition to the money, they were granted a permanent, top-tier security clearance and a contract as the exclusive civilian salvage partners for the Royal Navy's Historical Division. They weren't just rich, they were now part of the inner circle of maritime history. Liam and Noah returned to their yard, which was now quiet and empty. The Goliath was gone, reduced to piles of sorted steel and the memory of the engine. But they didn't retire to a beach in the Caribbean. The salt water was in their blood. They used the fortune to completely overhaul their operation. They bought a brand-new, state-of-the-art salvage vessel, equipped with side-scan sonar and ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, capable of reaching the darkest depths of the ocean. They named the new ship the Spirit of Sterling, in honor of the commander who had scuttled the tugboat to protect the secret. They kept one souvenir from the Goliath. Before the hull was scrapped, they had managed to save the ship's heavy brass telegraph from the bridge, the device used to signal the engine room. They mounted it in the lobby of their new headquarters. It was set permanently to "full ahead." It served as a reminder that the greatest treasures aren't always gold or silver. Sometimes they are hidden in the rust, waiting for someone brave enough to look beneath the surface. The brothers had bought a tugboat for scrap, but they had salvaged a legacy that would last for generations. The ocean was full of secrets, and now they had the means to find them all. Thanks for diving deep with us on this incredible journey.